In the heart of the great African kingdom of Ashera, nestled between towering mountains and lush savannas, the air was thick with excitement. The royal palace was alive with the chatter of courtiers, the clink of armor from the king's soldiers, and the bustling sounds of servants rushing to prepare for a historic moment. The land of Ashera had long been known for its rich culture, powerful traditions, and an unyielding spirit, but it was about to witness the arrival of a child who would change its future forever. At the royal palace, Queen Adama lay on her bed, surrounded by her most trusted women, the flickering light of burning incense filling the room with a soothing scent. Her face was calm, though a storm brewed inside her as she labored. Her husband, King Kofi, paced outside, his mind torn between excitement and anxiety. For years, they had longed for a child who would carry on the legacy of the Acheron throne. And today, the moment had finally arrived. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, a loud cry pierced the silence of the palace. Queen Adama, exhausted but overjoyed, cradled her newborn daughter in her arms. The baby girl, with skin as rich as the earth and eyes as deep as the night sky, opened her eyes for the first time, gazing at her mother with a curious, knowing stare. "This child is destined for greatness," the royal healer, Ayana, whispered as she looked down at the baby. "The stars have foretold it. The gods have blessed this kingdom with a ruler who will lead with strength and wisdom." Queen Adama smiled, though the words filled her with a sense of both pride and uncertainty. Her daughter, Princess Dalila, was the fulfillment of a prophecy that had been passed down through generations of Acheron rulers. It was said that a child born during the rare celestial event, when the twin moons aligned with the sun, would possess extraordinary powers and lead Ashera to unparalleled prosperity. But prophecies were as heavy a burden as they were a blessing. Dalila would be expected to live up to the expectations of her people, and the weight of that responsibility would follow her throughout her life. As the days turned into weeks, the kingdom celebrated the birth of their princess. In the royal courtyard, musicians played songs of joy, and the streets of Ashera were filled with dancing and laughter. But even in the midst of these celebrations, whispers of doubt began to spread. Some elders feared that the prophecy would be too much for a child to bear, and others questioned whether such a leader could truly rise to the occasion. As Dalila grew, it became clear that she was no ordinary child. From the moment she could walk, she exhibited an uncanny intelligence. She spoke with wisdom beyond her years, asking questions that most adults would shy away from. But it was her connection to the land that was truly remarkable. Dalila could communicate with the earth in ways that others could not understand. She could sense when the soil was in need of rain, and when the trees whispered their ancient secrets in the wind, Dalila listened. The elders of Ashera believed that this connection to the natural world was a sign of her unique abilities, perhaps even the magical powers foretold by the prophecy. Yet, despite her gifts, Dalila's life was far from easy. She was constantly reminded of the great expectations placed upon her. Her father, King Kofi, loved her dearly, but he was also a strict ruler, and he sought to mold her into a leader who would carry Ashera into a new era. He enrolled her in the palace's rigorous training program, where she studied diplomacy, military strategy, and the ancient traditions of Ashera. She was taught by the kingdom's finest tutors and was even trained in combat by the fiercest warriors in the land. But it wasn't just her father's expectations that weighed heavily on Dalila. Her mother, Queen Adama, though kind and loving, often expressed her own concerns. Adama feared that her daughter's connection to the earth and the supernatural might isolate her from the people of Ashera, who were known for their practicality and deep-rooted traditions. Would they accept a ruler who was both human and something more? One evening, as Dalila sat on the edge of a cliff overlooking the kingdom, her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of her father, King Kofi. His face was filled with both pride and worry. "My daughter," he began, sitting beside her, "you have grown into a wise and powerful young woman. But I must ask, do you understand the weight of the throne you are destined to inherit?" Dalila looked at her father, her gaze steady. "I understand, father. I know that my destiny is tied to this kingdom. But I also know that I must lead with my heart as well as my mind. I cannot simply follow tradition if it does not serve the people. King Kofi placed a hand on her shoulder. You are wise beyond your years, Dalila. But the people expect a ruler who will bring power, not just wisdom. The kingdom will need more than just a ruler, they will need a legend. And so, as the years passed, Princess Dalila grew stronger in both body and spirit. Yet with each day, the prophecy that bound her to Ashera's fate grew heavier. She knew that her journey would not be an easy one. There would be battles to fight, alliances to forge, and enemies to outsmart. But she also knew that the path she walked was her own to shape. And as she looked out over the kingdom, she could feel the stirrings of something deep within her, something that told her that, despite the doubts, she was ready for whatever lay ahead. The story of Princess Dalila had only just begun, but it was already clear that she would defy all odds to become a legend. Princess Dalila stood at the balcony of the royal palace, gazing out over the vast plains that stretched out before her. The sun had barely begun to rise, casting a golden hue over the land. Ashera, her beloved kingdom, seemed peaceful at that moment. But Dalila knew better. She could feel the unrest in the air, a growing tension that threatened to unravel the delicate balance her father had worked so hard to maintain. King Kofi had ruled Ashera for decades, his reign marked by prosperity and strength. But as he grew older, whispers of challenges to his rule began to spread. The neighboring kingdom of Zara, once a loyal ally, had been growing bolder in their demands. Their king, King Zubari, had sent several envoys to Ashera, requesting more territory in exchange for an alliance, an offer that King Kofi had always refused. Dalila had overheard these discussions in the palace corridors. She had learned from an early age that diplomacy was often a game of subtlety and strength. Yet, even with her keen intellect, she couldn't help but wonder what would happen if diplomacy failed. Would her father, in his old age, be able to protect the kingdom? Or would the weight of his years, combined with the external pressure, force Ashera into war? Dalila, a voice called, pulling her from her thoughts. She turned to see her father approaching, his posture straight and regal, though there was a weariness in his eyes. Despite the strength he projected, Dalila knew that the burdens of leadership were beginning to take their toll. The once indomitable king had begun to show signs of aging, his shoulders stooped a little, his movements slower, and his decisions more cautious. "Father," she replied, offering a respectful bow. "You look troubled." King Kofi smiled weakly. "I am troubled, my daughter. Zara is not as far from our borders as they once were. Their armies are growing stronger, and their ambitions grow with them. We cannot continue to ignore them forever." Dalila met her father's gaze, her heart heavy with the weight of their kingdom's future. She had known this moment would come, the moment when her training, her intellect, and her spirit would be tested. But she had never imagined it would come so soon. "What do you propose?" she asked, her voice steady. "I will send an envoy to Zara," the king replied. "But this will be my last effort for peace. If they refuse once more, I will have no choice but to call for war." Dalila felt a chill run through her. War was not the solution she had envisioned for Ashera, nor was it the legacy she wished to leave behind. But she knew that her father's decision, though difficult, was rooted in the survival of their people. She had to be ready for whatever came next. "Father, I wish to accompany you to the war councils," Dalila said, her voice resolute. "If the kingdom is to face war, I want to be part of the decision-making." King Kofi looked at her, surprised by her boldness. "You are still young, Dalila. Your place is here, in the palace. You have been trained to rule, but not to lead armies." "I am not asking to lead armies," Dalila replied, "but to offer counsel. I may not yet be a warrior, but I am the future of this kingdom. I must understand the decisions that shape it." Her father regarded her for a long moment, and Dalila could see the struggle in his eyes. He loved her dearly and had always seen her potential. Yet, he had also sheltered her from the darker realities of leadership, hoping to protect her from the dangers of war and the complexities of rule. But he could no longer deny that Dalila was ready for the challenges that lay ahead. "Very well," King Kofi said finally. "You may join the council. But understand that this is not an easy path. The weight of leadership is heavy, and the responsibility of this kingdom is not to be taken lightly." Dalila nodded, her resolve firm. She knew that her journey had only just begun, and that the path to leadership would be fraught with difficult choices and sacrifices. But she was ready. As the days passed, the threat of war loomed ever closer. King Zubari, in his arrogance, continued to press for Ashera's submission. His envoys had been clear: if Ashera did not yield to his demands, Zara would take what they wanted by force. King Kofi had tried to maintain the peace, but he knew the time for diplomacy was running out. Dalila spent long hours in the royal library, poring over ancient texts, military strategies, and the histories of Ashera's past rulers. She was determined to understand every facet of the kingdom, its alliances, its enemies, and its strengths. The more she learned, the more she realized that Ashera was not invincible. Their resources were vast, but so were their enemies' ambitions. The balance was fragile, and any misstep could lead to devastation. One evening, as Dalila was deep in thought, her childhood friend, Kofi, entered the room. Kofi had been her companion since they were children, a son of the kingdom's most trusted general. He was tall, with broad shoulders and the same determined gleam in his eyes that had always matched Dalila's own. But unlike Dalila, Kofi had been trained for battle, for war, for leadership of a different kind. "You're still here," Kofi said with a smile, though there was concern in his voice. "You've been studying these texts for days. You need rest." Dalila looked up at him, her brow furrowed. "I can't rest, Kofi. Ashera is on the brink of war, and I have to understand everything I can before we decide what to do. Our kingdom is at a crossroads." Kofi nodded, his expression serious. "I know. But you also have to remember that some things can't be solved with books or strategy. You'll need more than knowledge to lead this kingdom." Dalila's eyes met his, and for a moment the weight of her responsibility seemed to fall away. Kofi was right. She couldn't carry the burden of leadership alone, and she had to trust in her allies. "Will you fight by my side, Kofi?" Dalila asked, her voice soft but firm. "Always," Kofi replied without hesitation. "I fought by your side since we were children. Whatever comes, we will face it together." With that, Dalila felt a sense of peace settle within her. She knew that the days ahead would be difficult, but she was no longer alone in this. The call to leadership had been made, and she was ready to answer. The War Council convened a week later, and Dalila sat at the table with her father, his most trusted generals, and the kingdom's wise advisors. The room was tense, filled with the weight of impending decisions. King Kofi stood at the head of the table, his hand resting on the map of Ashera and Zara. "We are faced with a choice," King Kofi began, his voice steady. "Do we continue to negotiate with King Zubari, or do we prepare for battle?" Dalila stood and stepped forward. "Father, I believe that peace can still be achieved. But we must show strength, not weakness. If we give in now, we risk undermining the authority of Ashera. If we fight, we must fight smart. We know the terrain, we know their weaknesses. But we cannot afford to underestimate them." Her words hung in the air, and the room fell silent. King Kofi regarded his daughter with a mixture of admiration and concern. The moment had come for Dalila to take her first steps as a leader in her own right. She was no longer just a princess, she was the future of Ashera, and the kingdom's fate rested on her decisions. The months following the War Council were a whirlwind of activity. Princess Dalila's leadership, wisdom, and strategic mind had earned her the respect of the kingdom's military commanders and advisors. Ashera's forces, though not yet at war with Zara, had begun to prepare for the worst. The royal army underwent rigorous training, while Dalila worked tirelessly alongside her father to ensure that their defenses were impenetrable. But even as the kingdom prepared for conflict, a shadow hung over Ashera, a shadow that neither Dalila nor King Kofi could have anticipated. The unthinkable happened: betrayal. It started subtly, with small discrepancies in the royal court. Trusted advisors began to act strangely, their loyalties seemingly divided. Courtiers who had once pledged their unwavering allegiance to the crown now whispered behind closed doors, casting doubt on Ashera's future and its leadership. Among these was General Idris, one of the most respected military leaders in the kingdom and a man whom King Kofi had considered a close confidant. Idris had served Ashera for decades, earning the title of the kingdom's greatest strategist. He had fought in countless battles, earning the respect of soldiers and the trust of the royal family. But in recent weeks, his actions had grown more erratic. He had become distant, avoiding Dalila's council meetings and offering half-hearted advice when he did attend. His sudden absence from key military briefings was noticed by everyone, but no one dared question him until it was too late. One fateful evening, as Dalila stood in the royal gardens, contemplating the future of Ashera, Kofi approached her with a grave expression on his face. He was accompanied by two of his most trusted guards, their faces somber. "Father," Dalila greeted him, her tone already sensing the tension in the air. "Dalila," King Kofi began, his voice heavy. "There's been a grave betrayal. General Idris has defected to King Zubari." Dalila's heart sank. Idris, the man she had grown to trust as a mentor and ally, had turned against them. It was unfathomable. How could he, one of the kingdom's strongest defenders, betray Ashera in its moment of greatest need? How could this happen? Dalila asked, her voice shaking with a mix of disbelief and anger. "He was loyal," he swore an oath. "His loyalty was never to the kingdom," King Kofi said, his gaze piercing. "He was always more interested in power. Zubari promised him land, riches, and control over Ashera's military. In exchange, Idris has offered him inside information about our defenses. We are vulnerable, Dalila. We must act quickly." The realization struck Dalila like a bolt of lightning. They were not just facing an external threat, there was a traitor within their walls, and he had handed Ashera's most vital secrets to the enemy. A sense of urgency filled her chest as she struggled to keep her composure. "We cannot let this go unanswered," Dalila said, her voice sharp. "We need to strike fast before he can rally his forces. I'll gather the council." The next few days were filled with tension and fear. Dalila's heart ached as she realized the full extent of the betrayal. Her father, though steadfast, was deeply shaken by Idris' actions. As king, he had always believed that loyalty was a fundamental pillar of their rule, but now that pillar had crumbled. With the kingdom on the brink of war, the last thing they needed was internal disarray. Dalila had always known that leadership came with difficult decisions, but nothing could have prepared her for the weight of betrayal. She had trusted General Idris as a mentor, had relied on his counsel when making critical decisions. To learn that he had been feeding information to Zara for months felt like a personal loss. The war council was called into session, and Dalila sat at the head of the table, her eyes scanning the faces of her advisors. There was a deep silence in the room, each member of the council aware that the stakes had never been higher. General Idris' defection had placed Ashera in a precarious position, and now, every move they made would determine the fate of the kingdom. "We cannot afford to wait," Dalila said, her voice firm. "Zubari will move quickly to capitalize on this betrayal. We must act now to prevent him from gaining any more ground." One of the senior generals, Commander Kwame, spoke up. "Dalila, we cannot fight a war on two fronts. We must deal with the threat from Zara, but we also need to ensure that those within our own walls who have sided with Idris are dealt with. Dalila nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. Agreed. We cannot allow a fifth column to sabotage us from within. I'll personally oversee the investigation into our own ranks. We must root out every traitor. The council members nodded in agreement, though the tension in the room was palpable. Everyone understood that the coming days would be filled with difficult choices that would affect not just the kingdom, but Dalila's legacy as its future ruler. The next few days were a blur. Dalila worked tirelessly to oversee the military preparations and manage the internal unrest caused by the betrayal. General Idris had managed to escape Ashira's borders before they could apprehend him, and Dalila knew that Subari's forces would soon be on their way, emboldened by the information they had gained. As the kingdom's defenses were bolstered, Dalila found herself increasingly isolated. She had always been close to her father, but his health had begun to decline rapidly, leaving her with an ever greater responsibility. King Kofi's years of ruling had taken a toll on him, and though he was still a powerful figure, Dalila knew that the weight of leadership would soon fall entirely on her shoulders. One evening, as Dalila sat alone in the war room, Kofi entered quietly, his face drawn with exhaustion. "Dalila," he said softly, sitting beside her. "You've done everything you can. The kingdom's future is in your hands now." Dalila looked at her father, her heart heavy with the weight of her role. "I don't know if I'm ready, father. You've always been there to guide me. Now it feels as if the entire kingdom is depending on me." King Kofi smiled faintly, reaching out to take her hand. "You are more than ready, Dalila. You've been prepared for this moment your entire life. The strength you carry is not just from me, it's in your blood, in your spirit. You are Ashira's future." Dalila's eyes filled with determination. She had learned so much from her father, but it was time for her to forge her own path. No longer could she rely on the comfort of tradition or the wisdom of others. She would lead Ashira with her heart, her mind, and the courage she had cultivated over the years. The morning after her conversation with her father, Dalila gathered her most trusted allies. The time for waiting was over. War with Zara was imminent, and Dalila knew that Ashira's fate was in her hands. "Prepare yourselves," she said to her generals and advisors. "We will face a battle unlike any this kingdom has seen. But we will not fall. Ashira's legacy will live on, and we will fight with all the strength we have." As the armies of Ashira prepared for battle, Dalila felt the weight of her destiny pressing down on her. She had been born to lead, to protect, and to defend her people. And now, it was time to show the world what she was truly made of. The battle for Ashira was upon them, and the kingdom's very existence was on the line. Princess Dalila stood at the edge of the royal citadel, her eyes fixed on the horizon, where the first signs of dawn were beginning to paint the sky with streaks of gold and crimson. The air was thick with tension, the quiet before the storm settling over the land. Behind her, the preparations for war were in full swing. Soldiers lined the courtyard, sharpening their weapons and preparing their armor. The royal army, bolstered by a coalition of Ashira's most loyal allies, was ready for the coming conflict. Dalila could feel the weight of the responsibility bearing down on her. This was no longer just about defending her people, it was about preserving the legacy of the kingdom, the lives of her subjects, and the future she envisioned for Ashira. She had worked tirelessly in the months leading up to this moment, strengthening alliances, fortifying the kingdom's defenses, and ensuring the people were united in purpose. But now, as she stood on the precipice of war, the true test of her leadership was about to unfold. She turned, her gaze falling on her father, King Kofi, who had joined her on the balcony. His once proud and strong figure was now stooped with age, his face lined with the experiences of a lifetime of leadership. He had been a great king, beloved by his people, but Dalila knew that his time was coming to an end. The weight of his leadership had taken its toll, and though he had mentored her every step of the way, she now stood as Asherah's future. "Father," Dalila said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Are you certain this is the right course?" King Kofi nodded, his expression resolute. "It is, Dalila. We've waited too long. Zara will not stop until they have Asherah, and if we yield now, we risk losing everything. Your strength has brought us to this moment, and it will guide us through the battle ahead." Dalila met her father's gaze, the sense of duty she had inherited from him settling into her bones. She had always known this moment would come, though she had hoped it would remain a distant possibility. Now there was no turning back. "Then we fight," she said quietly, her resolve hardening. "We fight with everything we have." The king placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip surprisingly firm for a man of his age. "You are the heart of Asherah now, Dalila. Your leadership will carry us to victory, just as I know your wisdom will rebuild us afterward. Never forget who you are." Dalila nodded, her heart swelling with pride and sadness at once. She had always admired her father's strength, but now it was her turn to lead. She had been trained for this moment her entire life, and she would not falter. Not now. The battlefield was set. The forces of Asherah and Zara would meet at the Valley of Elders, a strategic location where the land was both vast and unforgiving. The valley's terrain was rugged, offering both advantages and risks to any army that entered it. Dalila had studied the map countless times, formulating a plan that would allow Asherah's smaller forces to strike swiftly and decisively. Her goal was not just to defend but to make the first strike, one that would send a message to King Zubari and his forces. As the royal army marched toward the valley, Dalila led the charge alongside her generals, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. The soldiers' footsteps echoed in the air, and the banners of Asherah fluttered proudly in the wind. Dalila's mind was focused solely on the task at hand, strategy, execution, and the safety of her people. Her thoughts wandered briefly to her childhood, to the lessons her father had taught her, and to the friends she had made along the way. Now, her childhood was behind her, and the future of the kingdom was within her grasp. "We are almost there," Kofi said, his voice gravely serious as he rode beside her. "Are you ready?" Dalila nodded. "I've never been more ready." As they approached the valley, the kingdom's forces spread out, taking strategic positions along the ridges that bordered the battlefield. Asherah's warriors were well-trained, their spirits high, and their loyalty unwavering. Dalila's presence alone had given them confidence, and she knew she would need every ounce of that faith in the coming hours. "We strike at dawn," Dalila instructed, her voice ringing clear over the chatter of the soldiers. "We will use the terrain to our advantage. Stay sharp, stay united. The first blow must come swiftly." Her generals nodded, understanding the gravity of the plan. They would strike hard and fast, pushing Zara's forces into a position where they would be unable to retreat or regroup. It was a high-risk strategy, but Dalila had always believed in the element of surprise, and this was the perfect opportunity. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, Dalila found herself standing at the head of her forces, her sword drawn and gleaming in the pale light. The sounds of war, the clatter of armor, the shouts of soldiers, filled the air as they prepared for the final battle. Dalila took a deep breath, steadying herself. This moment was everything. The eyes of Asherah were upon her, and the future of her people rested on her leadership. The ground beneath her feet trembled as the sound of Zara's approaching army echoed through the valley. King Zubari's forces had arrived, their heavy armor glinting in the moonlight. Dalila could see the arrogance in their ranks, their confidence that they would easily overpower Asherah. But she knew better. The terrain was their greatest ally, and Asherah's soldiers were fighting for their home, their land, and their future. She raised her sword high, the symbol of Asherah's resilience and strength. "For Asherah," she cried. The battle began with a deafening roar. The armies collided with ferocity, the clash of steel against steel ringing out over the valley. Dalila fought alongside her soldiers, her instincts sharp, her movements swift. She had trained for this moment, and now it was time to put her knowledge and skills to the test. As the battle raged on, Dalila's mind raced, constantly calculating the movements of the enemy. She saw an opening in Zara's line and, with a swift command, led a small group of elite soldiers to break through. The momentum shifted in Ashera's favor, and the enemy began to falter. But as the tide of battle turned, Dalila's heart sank. In the chaos, she saw a figure she had not expected to encounter, General Idris. His eyes, once filled with loyalty, were now cold and calculating as he led Zara's forces against her. The betrayal that had once seemed distant was now before her, and it cut deeper than any wound. "You," Dalila breathed, her voice filled with both anger and disbelief. Idris' lips curled into a mocking smile. "You should have known, princess. Power is the only thing that matters. Ashera was always weak, its people, its leadership. Now, it's mine." Dalila gritted her teeth, her grip on her sword tightening. "Ashera will never fall to traitors like you." The battle raged on around them, but for Dalila, it was no longer just about strategy. It was personal. The man she had once trusted, the man she had believed in, was now her enemy. And she would not let him destroy the kingdom she loved. The battle raged on in the Valley of Elders, an unforgiving testament to the brutal clash of two armies. The echoes of steel crashing against steel reverberated across the rocky expanse, the cries of soldiers lost in the carnage filling the air. Dust rose in thick clouds, obscuring the battlefield, but Dalila's focus remained clear. The stakes could not have been higher. She was not just fighting for Ashera's survival, she was fighting for its soul, its people, and its future. Through the chaos, Dalila's gaze never left General Idris. His betrayal had cut through her like a blade, but now was not the time for hesitation. It was a fight she had to win, not just for herself, but for the countless souls of Ashera who depended on her. The loyalty of the kingdom's warriors, the trust her people had placed in her, and the legacy of her father all stood on the line. With every step she took toward Idris, her resolve solidified. The man who had once been a mentor, a trusted figure in her life, had now become the embodiment of everything Ashera fought against: treachery, power hunger, and the destruction of the kingdom's harmony. She could not afford to show mercy. Not now. Dalila's sword flashed in the dim light as she cut through the enemy's ranks, each strike a testament to the strength and precision she had honed over the years. Her generals, who had fought alongside her, followed her lead, rallying the Ashera forces with unwavering devotion. The momentum was shifting, but Dalila knew that this was not yet the turning point. To defeat Idris, to bring an end to this battle, she would have to face him directly. As she reached the heart of the battlefield, where the forces of Zara were concentrated, Dalila's eyes locked on Idris. He stood tall, his armor gleaming, a cruel smirk dancing on his lips. His eyes met hers with a coldness that sent a chill through her. "I never thought it would come to this, Dalila," Idris called, his voice carrying over the din of the battle. "But power, true power, was always the goal. Ashera's rule was never meant to be yours." Dalila's jaw clenched. The betrayal stung more than anything, but she could not let it distract her. "You were never meant to be a king, Idris. You were meant to protect Ashera, not destroy it." "Protect?" Idris laughed, his voice laced with venom. "I've done more than protect. I've built something far greater than your naive idealism ever could. Zara will rise, and Ashera will fall." Dalila's sword glinted in the moonlight as she advanced, her eyes never leaving his. "You've chosen the wrong side. And now, you will pay the price." With a flash of movement, Dalila lunged, her sword clashing against Idris with a resounding clang. The force of the blow reverberated through her arm, but she did not flinch. She knew that this was the moment that would determine everything. If she hesitated, if she faltered, Ashera would fall. Idris grunted, pushing back with a strength that belied his age. You think you can defeat me, Dalila? You are nothing compared to the power I wield now. I have allies in Zara who will ensure that Ashera burns. Your kingdom is doomed. Dalila's heart burned with fury. How could someone so loyal to Ashera betray everything for a taste of power? She fought not just for the kingdom, but for the ideals that Ashera represented: unity, loyalty, and freedom. She would not allow this man to bring those ideals crashing down. With a swift movement, Dalila parried Idris' blow and struck again. This time, her sword found its mark. Idris staggered back, his face twisted in disbelief. He had underestimated her, and now it was too late. Your time is over, Dalila said, her voice firm and unwavering. She stepped forward, her sword raised high. Idris, his eyes wide with shock, dropped to his knees, clutching at the wound she had inflicted. His once proud stance was gone, replaced by the bitter reality of his defeat. You can't do this, he gasped, his voice hoarse. You can't destroy everything I've built. Dalila looked down at him, her face a mixture of sadness and resolve. You destroyed everything yourself, Idris. Ashera was never meant to be built on betrayal. It was meant to be built on unity. Your greed has doomed you. With a final, decisive motion, Dalila raised her sword and struck. The man who had once been her mentor and friend crumpled before her, his life extinguished in the very place he had sought to conquer. The battlefield fell silent. For a long moment, Dalila stood over the fallen general, her heart heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. The battle was over, but the cost had been high. Ashera had won, but at a price that could never be fully paid. The forces of Zara had been defeated, but the kingdom had lost one of its greatest protectors to betrayal. As the smoke of battle began to clear, Dalila turned to survey the battlefield. Ashera's soldiers stood victorious, their faces battered but proud. Her generals, weary yet resolute, gathered around her, offering their support and congratulations. But Dalila felt no joy in the victory. This was not a triumph of conquest. It was the end of a chapter and the beginning of a long, painful rebuilding. King Kofi approached, his face tired but filled with quiet pride. He placed a hand on Dalila's shoulder, his touch comforting despite the heaviness in the air. You did it, Dalila, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Ashera stands because of you. Dalila nodded, but her eyes were distant. She had fought not just for the kingdom, but for something greater, the preservation of its soul. Ashera stands, she said softly, but the cost has been great. Many lives have been lost, too many. This is only the beginning. There is much work to be done. Kofi looked at his daughter with pride, his voice filled with certainty. You will rebuild. Ashera is yours to lead now. And I know you will guide it to greatness. Dalila glanced over the battlefield once more, the weight of her father's words sinking in. The future of Ashera was now in her hands. The kingdom would rise from the ashes of this war, stronger, wiser, and more united. It would never forget the lessons learned, the sacrifices made, and the betrayals that almost destroyed it. But Ashera would endure. As long as there were leaders like Dalila, strong, wise, and unyielding, the kingdom would never fall. The legacy of Ashera, a kingdom built on unity and strength, would carry on through the ages, as timeless and enduring as the land itself. Dalila sheathed her sword and looked to the horizon, where the first rays of dawn began to break through the clouds. A new day had begun, and with it, a new era for Ashera. And with that, the legend of Princess Dalila was written in the annals of history, the legend not of power or conquest, but of resilience, wisdom, and the unshakable strength of a people who would never surrender.